All right, take your Bible if you would and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel, nope, not 23. We did that last week. Let's try 24. Let's go to 24. As you're turning to 1 Samuel chapter 24, get ready for the collective gasp. Get ready for it. Don't do it. Just get ready for it. I contend to be a controller. I know that comes as a shock to some of you. I know it's a huge shock to my own family. But let me tell you something else. So are you. I mean, we can agree to disagree on the degree of how one might be more controlling than another person, or the razor's edge between micromanaging the situation versus micromanaging the people, or the razor's edge between being a micromanager or a responsible leader. And we can disagree on those degrees, right? But at the end of the day, I think what we would all agree on is we all like to control our own lives, right? I mean, let's be honest. It is Sunday. In other words, if you think about it, our entire day is filled with us controlling our own lives. I mean, they don't call it control portions for nothing. You control your diet. You control what kind of food we should be to a degree, right? There's always the other side of the ditch, right? But control our portions of the food we eat, when we eat, right? The older you get, you have it's time to eat. Right? You control the timing of when you eat. You control which, for some of you, which hairstylist you go to. Like you choose a certain hairstylist. And then you go in and you're like, I want this on this. And then that leads to every day on your own, in your own bathroom, controlling your hair to get it to look like that every day. You go shopping, right? Maybe Amazon shopping, it's like, I'm going to control what I buy, and I buy this, and then it goes into your closet, and every day you control what you put on. You control even how many times a day you're going to change depending on the occasion of that particular day. You control your appearance. You control your pets. In pet world, you're even called its master. Because you can't master your kids, and we conveniently call that parenting, and rightly so. We actually wasn't being funny on that one. We do call it parenting. And then we manage our kids, but then that crosses a line, and now we are doing what to our kids? I'm controlling my kids. Again, pause right there. We all have different and varying degrees to which we maybe parent, manage, master, micromanage our kids, right? Different degrees there. Work. I mean, if I were to step into your place of work, then I'm going to walk away saying this. Okay, well, you call me a micromanager. I'm going to call you a micromanager. Let me mess this up. I step into your car. Right, step into your house. Up, take your shoes off. Right, you're going to control the situation. And already you might be thinking to yourself, well, yeah, there's some legitimacy to being responsible. Yes, there is. But where's the line? It's a razor's edge line, isn't it? When we control our entire lives, even all the way into our death, with such a thing called a will. I'm going to control who gets what, right? And for my family, it's nothing, so congratulations. See, I'm not a controller. Right there. You only need one example to prove it. You control all the way to the very cemetery and the tombstone you pick out, and perhaps even for some of you, the very detailed order of your funeral service you're controlling. Don't tell me we're not controlling people. We are. We control our lives every day, all day long. We climb in to the car of our lives and take control of the steering wheel with both hands, seeking to control it. David finds himself in this situation this morning in chapter 24. He's got a decision to make. Is he going to control, or is he going to commit it into God's hand? We want to control our lives, and there's no greater occasion for this to be manifested than when suffering, trials, and obstacles come into the very life we're seeking to be king of. Let me state that again. We live our lives every day, all day long, establishing the kind of kingdom we want to live in and the kind of throne we want to be upon. Until something else interferes with that. It's called suffering. It's called trials. It's called an obstacle. And when something interferes with us establishing the very kingdom that we want, then what do? Do you take control of it with your own hands? Or do you commit it into God's hands? That's where David finds himself in chapter 24. You say, well, how do I know? How do I know? This is the question you need to ask yourself, even throughout this message. How do you know when you're controlling things with your own hands or committing it into God's hands? How do you know? I think there are some indications. And yes, Blake, there are three. There are three indicators to help you know if you are actually committing it into God's hands. Now, you can spin it the other way. You know when you're taking control when these are not manifested in your life. And if you like to throw it as a question, then you can throw it as a question too, and we'll do that throughout our time this morning. But David has a situation, and he comes into chapter 24, verses 1 through 7, with a situation. He has a decision to make, and I think we see the first one in verses 1 through 7 that is this. You're committing it into God's hands when you obey God's will. That's the first point. Now, hang with me. That might seem like an underwhelming point. Like, I thought we already looked at that. Well, there's actually another layer and level to this, so be patient. But David here has a decision to make, whether he's going to commit it into God's hands or he's going to take it into his hands. Let me set it up for us. Again, chapter 26 is in fact, if you were to throw up on maybe a whiteboard a literary analysis of 24 and 26, they would almost be identical. To the degree that some say it's the exact same scene. I don't hold to that. But it is very helpful seeing both of them together. Let me give you the setting of both. In chapter 24, the setting is this. Saul's 6,000 men have just caught up to David. Well, nature calls. Saul's got to make a pit stop. He's got 6,000 men outside of a cave. And in this cave, because David and his spies had found out that Saul's en route, they hide in this cave. Now, the caves in this area are very deep and large, right? And they have massive tunnels that connect to other caves. And so David and his 600 men are backed up, kind of like squatting down in the recesses of this cave. And lo and behold, Saul walks in to use the restroom. Chapter 26, you don't have to go there, just you know the story. David and his men are up on the mountain or the side of the mountain, and Saul's 6,000 men catch up to David again. And now God causes a deep sleep to come upon Saul and his men, and David has another decision to make. You see, both times Saul finds himself exposed in a very vulnerable position, does he not? I don't know of two other occasions in a person's life which is as vulnerable as asleep and using the toilet. Right? And David has a decision to make. And in David's ear, in both of these settings, is David's men whispering to him things like this. Maybe singing, "This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it," right? David, this is God's doing. David, this is exactly what Samuel said would happen. You would become king. This was affirmed by Jonathan. You would become king. David, this is the providential hand of God. I mean, David, come on, man. Of all the caves Saul could have chosen from, he chooses this one. I mean, this is obvious. David, look at the miraculous slumber that has come upon all these men. David, this is your chance. Kill King Saul. And you're David. And you're listening to it. And you have a decision to make. Verses 1 through 7, let me read it. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men of all Israel and went out to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came into the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall go, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. And David got up from the recesses of the cave, and he approached Saul. David went down the mountain toward Saul and camped there in the middle, fast asleep. He draws his sword out of his sheath. He picks up Saul's spear next to his head. And Saul, verse 4, and David, verse 4b, cuts off the corner of Saul's robe, where he takes the spear back up to the mountain. And afterward, David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul finished his business, rose up, and left the cave and went back to his army. David has a decision to make. On one hand, I'm going to say David is tempted. Can we say that? David is tempted. He's tempted with the whispers of people who are giving actually partial truth. Yes, David's men are conveying God's promise to David, but yet they are embellishing it a bit and twisting it a bit. David is being tempted here, folks. David has a decision to make. And as he creeps up to Saul, and pulls out the sword to kill Saul, David's conscience is convicted. God's Spirit gets a hold of him. And David now has a decision. Is he going to kill Saul, or is he going to what? Obey God's will. What is God's will? Do not lay your hand on God's anointed. Yes, David's telling his men, Saul's a worthless fellow. But I think the phrase is something like, you salute the person, not the man, or something like that, or the office and not the man. He's a worthless fellow, but at the end of the day, he is still God's anointed. He is still king. He still needs to and deserves honor and respect, all the while, yes, being a worthless fellow. David has a decision, and he decides to obey God's will. Now, stop, time out. There's another layer to this that I think we need to get. David tears his robe. Now you could read this and you might walk away saying David's conscience convicted him. He felt guilt because he tore the corner of the robe. That might be. Personally, I lean a little bit more towards the fact that his conscience convicted him. He felt guilt because he was about to kill Saul. Whichever the case might be, it's a bit irrelevant because at the end of the day, he does take a garment or a piece of his robe, and that robe symbolized Saul's kingship and kingdom. Guilt over tearing his robe may be, but nonetheless a symbolic attack. And he takes that corner of the garment, fulfilling really the initial prophecy of Samuel. As Samuel, because Saul disobeyed God's will, Samuel said, I'm done with you, Saul. And Samuel turns his back on him. And what does Saul do? He grabs Samuel's robe and pulls a portion of Samuel's garment. And Samuel turns back to him and says, and so it will be with your kingdom too. It will be taken from you and given to the hands of another. Well, lo and behold, the symbol is coming to fruition even now, as David has a portion of Saul's robe in his hand. Same with the spear. Symbolic of kingship and kingdom. David has both. He has robe and he has spear. And he has made a decision to obey God's will and not lay his hand on the Lord's anointed. Which means this, folks. David trusted God with the consequences of his obedience. David trusted God with the consequences of his obedience. You know what that means? He had a conscientious decision that he had to make because of an internal struggle. Will I obey God? Which means I must wait. Do you understand that obeying God isn't the hardest part of the Christian life? It's when obeying God means you have to wait on something that's been promised to you. It means living the Christian life, obeying God's will and word, means waiting under the pressure of the moment. He chose to obey God's will because he trusted God with the consequences of obedience, which meant he must stay under the pressure and wait. You tell me, you're David in the cave, what would you have done? Would you have pulled the sword and hacked Saul because you knew that this was God's will, your kingship? It would have meant you would have been removed out from under the chase of Saul for who knows how many years now. That which God has promised you could be grasped right now. You could go back home with your family, and it's all done. The weight is lifted. No. David trusted God with the consequences of obedience, and that meant waiting. It means waiting. How about you? That's the hard part, isn't it? Waiting for God's promised will to come to fruition. Now, David's able to obey God's will. He's able to trust God for the consequences of his obedience, even though it means waiting, because he trusts in the sovereign hands of God to make that promise of kingship come about. Trust God for the consequences of your obedience, even if it means waiting. Waiting. It's much easier to grab control of the steering wheel of life, isn't it? To get out from under the weight, take matters into your own hands, and you can even justify it to yourself, as David's men were whispering into his ear. Rather than trying to get out of the pressure, trust God for the consequences of your obedience. And Saul leaves, right? He heads back to his army. Saul's maybe 100 yards, 200 yards. David steps out of the cave. After rebuking and addressing his men, David steps out of the cave and he calls out to Saul. Can you imagine? David calls out to Saul, King Saul, King Saul. And in that moment, his heart must have been racing. The blood's pumping. The emotions that came upon Saul, hearing David's voice come from the very cave that he was just in an exposed and vulnerable position. He is overwhelmed with emotions, and there's David even now showing him, look what I have. I've got your robe. I've got your spear. Why does David do that? I think the answer to that question leads us to the second indicator, found in verses 8 through 15, and that is this: because David trusts God's justice. David trusted God's justice. How do you know when you're committing your life and the situation of suffering in your life unto God? Do you trust God's justice? Where do you get that? Let's look at the text here, verses 8 through 15. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My Lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David, with a spirit of humility, right? He bows down with his face to the earth and paid homage. Or homage, I still don't know. Homage, it doesn't matter. Verse 9, and David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. Chapter 26, see the spear in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, or took your spear and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. And then down to verse 15, may the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. Let me ask you again now. David could have whacked King Saul. He holds up his corner of the robe. He holds up the spear. Why does he do that? And in both situations and the settings, yes, it's evidence. But do not walk away here thinking that David's holding up these pieces of evidence saying, Saul, I had you here, and I had you here. You better not be caught with your pants down again, because I'm not going to be Mr. Nice Guy next time. I'm coming after you. You better call off the chase right now. Don't make me, right? See? Proof. No, that's not what he's doing. So then why does he take the evidence? Why does he show the evidence to Saul? I think it's because David wants to show Saul who the righteous one is. He wants to show Saul who the evil one is. He wants to show Saul that for the entire time David has not been pursuing Saul, David's not the one who's in the wrong here. Saul, you are in the wrong here. You have been chasing me, pursuing me, and here, look, I could have killed you. But what I'm showing you now, Saul, is I am showing you that I am not returning evil for evil. I am showing you, Saul, I am the righteous one here. What is he doing? He is showing Saul that he trusts in God's justice. I'm sure I don't need to tell you this morning, but life isn't fair. And maybe I don't need to tell you either, but people aren't fair. This entire sin-cursed world is not fair. And in living in this world, in this unfair, sin-cursed world, we butt up against people and enter into and engage in relationships with even evil people. How are you going to respond when suffering and trials at the hands of evil people enter into your life and impact and become a roadblock for you pursuing and establishing your own kingdom? What are you going to do? You know what I want to do in my flesh? I want to return, you tell me, evil for evil. You know what that means? I'm taking control. When you return evil for evil, you're taking control. When you don't return evil for evil, that means you're trusting in God's justice and you've committed it into God's sovereign hands. I love 1 Peter. A couple of us were talking about 1 Peter this morning. 1 Peter begins, this isn't another message, so just, you're okay here. So 1 Peter, I would love to, it's close. 1 Peter begins in a way that most apostles do. It's like, let me tell you about your salvation by the grace of God, right, through the person and work of Jesus Christ. Now, because you're this way, now live like it. It's interesting in Peter, he spends 2 chapters listing several occasions of relationship problems wherein the believer is not to return evil for evil, but actually to submit under the pressure of those evil relationships. He starts with government, civil authority, He moves into the workplace. Yes, I know it's not an apples to apples with the first century workplace and today's workplace, but the spirit of it is still the same. Then he moves into relationships even with a husband and wife. And then he moves into the relationships with one another, even in the church setting where someone might revile you and slander you. Paul, in Romans chapter 12, would tell us, be patient in tribulation, wait. Later on, those few verses later in Romans chapter 12, he would tell us, beloved, never avenge yourselves. Isn't that hard? There's not a person here that in his flesh, in the moment, wants to immediately return evil for evil. Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. Leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. I think the emphasis there is, I will repay, not you. So hands off. Trust God's justice. And trusting God's justice is the means by which the believer is to persevere under the weight of suffering, even suffering at the hands of evil people. Now, quick time out so you don't walk out of here mishearing me. God also, in which we are to trust, has designed by his divine mercy order and institutions to take care of justice at the same hand. So if a spouse is getting beat up, don't say that the position of Grace Bible Church is suck it up and stay under it. Right? It's 911. Within a church setting, God's justice does come through the proper order and execution within a local church to bring about a sense of justice. Don't mishear me. But folks, if we have a bent, our posture typically bends towards retaliation, seeking revenge, returning evil for evil. And so let's move the needle a little bit more over the other way. Second indicator that you're committing it into God's hands is if you trust God's justice. And when that happens, that puts your heart into a certain heart posture to lead to the third indicator and our final one found in the closing verses 16 to 22. Let me read these. On the screen, the third one is this: show God's goodness. Show God's goodness. Verse 16 and following, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. You don't need to ask yourself, are these genuine tears? It's irrelevant. It's not the point of the passage here. I'm not saying it's improper to have that thought. 17, he said to David, "You are more righteous than I." It's as if God is speaking through the words of Saul to affirm and encourage David. Out of the mouth of Saul comes to David, "You are more righteous than I. For you have repaid me." Say it together. That was terrible, folks. You have repaid me. It's the point. We got to stress it again. Trust God's goodness, right? You've repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, so that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. What is Saul asking? David, keep being good to my family. Keep showing goodness. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Just because you trust God's justice doesn't mean you trust the person who's evil. David doesn't trust him. Saul went back and was like, I'm still going this way. But that doesn't mean David stopped showing kindness and goodness to Saul, because David continues to do so. And David, that has been the pattern of David's life, has it not? Why? Because he is a man after God's own heart. He has the character of God. He shows goodness. Even from the very beginning. Even when the top 100 songs hit and David's more famous, right, than Saul, and they're singing that in community, David's just blah, 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 blah. I think it was a harp. It doesn't matter. He's playing the instrument, right? He's playing an instrument to Saul because Saul is what? He's downcast. And even David playing the instrument for Saul is seeking out of the goodness of his heart to lift him up. Meanwhile, what's Saul doing? Throwing spears at him. Evil. Evil continually. David continually shows goodness all the way into our setting today, where he could have took him out, but he didn't. He didn't return evil for evil. He returned good for evil. He returned good for evil, folks. Let me stop. If you're asleep, then wake up. All right? Let me just stop. Like, practically speaking, let me ask you this. This third point. We're almost done. Trust God's goodness. Do you know the world, the critics are saying, that's only so God can control you? You Christians, you're delusional. You're deceived. All you're doing, what's the puppet with the hand, the strings? That one. That's all you are. That's all you are. Sure, God wants you to let go of the control so he can have the control over you. See? He's an egotistical God who's only in it for himself. Wake up, Christians, right? Can't you see it? Can't you see God is holding back on you? And in the first account where good and evil arises in the garden, this is exactly what the serpent Satan wanted the believers, God's people, to buy into, and that is this: God's holding back to you. Hath God said, for in the day you eat of it, you will actually what? You'll become like God. Take control, Adam and Eve. Take control. See, God's wanting to take control because he's a selfish, egotistical God. Don't you see it, Christian? But we know the truth, right? We know the truth. And that's not the truth at all. That's a lie. Rather, God is sovereignly leading his people to persevere in hard times, returning good for evil so that his goodness can be seen in the world. You see that? Why is God parenting you? Why is God managing you? Why is God leading you? Why is he working in your life specifically to return good for evil? Because that's what the world needs to see, is the goodness of God. If you take control, if you do not commit it to God, if you take control, you will return evil for evil. And when you return evil for evil, what is not seen is the goodness of God. You understand that? It is the goodness of God that this world needs to see. And by God, preserving you under the weight of the sufferings in your life to return good for evil. Through that, waiting under the pressures of life, the goodness of God is on display. That's why God does this. For his goodness to be seen. But we must remember that the goodness of God is seen greatest when his people persevere under the suffering of life, returning good for evil. Trust God's goodness. Trust God's goodness. And when we show goodness, we submit to his will. And yes, his control in our lives, who will one day right all the wrongs and will then give those whom have been a blessing in return, folks. You say, where is that found? Well, again, 1 Peter, you don't need to turn there. But 1 Peter, speaking of our future inheritance of glory in God's eternal kingdom in chapter 1, do not repay evil for evil, but on the contrary, bless. Bless, do good. For to this you were called, so that you would receive a blessing. We bless and show the goodness of God so the world can be drawn to the goodness of God and be saved. And in turn, the result is we receive a blessing. We receive our inheritance. We receive, folks, our kingdom in the future. In the future. In the meantime, we persevere under the weight of this life, returning good for evil, not evil for evil. And this future blessing of King David is God's will, is it not? But David submitted himself to the truth that God is sovereign over the end, the promise, but also the means to the end. But also the means to the end. David was learning, as you and I are too, that trusting in God's sovereign hand means we obey God's will. It means we trust God's justice, and it means we trust God's goodness. You see, the question really isn't, is David going to rise to the throne, is it? It's not going to be, will David rise to the throne? It will be, how does David rise to the throne? Will David rise to the throne has already been promised by a sovereign God into David's life. He will be king. The question is, how would he rise to the throne? Would he take human, earthly measures and matters to get to that throne? Would he take control? Or would he entrust himself into God's sovereign hands? And the David points, as we all know, to a closer and a more perfect David. Last week I said we're not all David. I quickly realized afterwards that there are some Davids here. I apologize for those of you that actually are David, right? On one hand, we're not David, except the few that are Davids here. It points to the greater David, yes? Who had the same question asked him. It's not about will Jesus rise to the throne, but how would he rise to the throne? As Satan tempted him in the wilderness, as God actually tested him in the wilderness by leading him into the wilderness, Jesus was tested and tempted by Satan to do what? Jesus, all you need to do is bow down and worship me, and I will give you the what? The kingdom. It's yours for the taking. You can have it right now. But Jesus perfectly resisted, trusting in God's sovereign hands, and waited. Waited for the crown, which meant he had to experience the suffering of the cross. And so the question comes for you and I too, because of Jesus, whom 1 Peter tells us we're to follow in his steps. He is our example, but you know he's more than our example. It is because of the powerful gospel work of Jesus on the cross and his death and his burial and resurrection and ascension with the dissension of the Spirit that we actually are now enabled to commit this life into his hands. So the question is for you this morning, not about will you rise to the throne. As believers, that's promised. The question is, how will you do it? Will you take control of your own life? Or will you commit it into God's hands? For we too must remember this morning, our big idea as we wrap up, that receiving your kingdom or your blessing, your future blessing, requires handing your life in the situations in your life over into God's hands? How will you rise to the throne? I pray that we would commit it into God's hands and not take control. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time in the Word this morning with your church. Father, thank you for the truth that you have given us. Father, what we ask at this time for the believer in this room, give us grace based upon the finished work of Jesus Christ and the ongoing work of the Spirit to daily commit the very challenging situations in our lives into your hands. Be committed to you. Encourage us in this, we pray. Help us not to take control. Father, give us the grace to do this. Father, for the unbeliever who might be here, the message is still the same. To receive this eternal kingdom and promised blessing, it does require handing the control of our lives over to you. Father, I pray that you would even work in their hearts this morning. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that you are a sovereign God who loves us. Helps to trust you daily. In your Son's name, amen.